Welcome, everyone. Episode 20 of the Dolphins Make Me Cry podcast. And man, we got a lot to unpack today. We're in the home stretch of the season. We have 4 games to go. Will the Dolphins make a push to make the playoffs? That is the magic question on every Dolphin fan's mind. And a lot went on this week. So let's start last week where Dolphins Jets, Hard Rock Stadium, Dolphins win in overtime 32-26 in a game that was a hell of a lot closer than it ever should have been. You know, the Dolphins have a lot of issues defensively, particularly with a lack of pass rush. Now, what did that lead to last week? That led to Aaron Rodgers kind of turning the clock back, playing a game where he was able to make a lot of plays, where he was able to stretch the field, hit a lot of big plays with Garrett Wilson, Devontae Adams, and it was kind of crazy because of the fact that the Jets still didn't really have much of a running game. They had no Breece Hall. They had no Sauce Gardner in the secondary. And they really did a hell of a job against the Dolphins defense, particularly Jalen Ramsey. So the defensive performance last week going into this stretch of 4 games, particularly where we're going to be at in Houston this week, worries me tremendously. The lack of a pass rush on this team is really, really killing it. Now, this week, Bradley Chubb, he practiced like he did last week. You think he'll probably play this week. Hopefully it'll be limited because you do not want to rush him back. He admitted this week that last year when he got hurt in Baltimore on New Year's Eve that he tore his ACL and PCL. He basically completely tore his entire knee up, where the rumor was he only had torn his ACL. So for them this week, do I think he'll play? I do. Do I think he will? Obviously, it needs to be on a snap count. Yes. Hopefully that will bring something to the table from a pass rush perspective. Also, Cameron Good, who got hurt in the Titans game last year, the Monday night game. Solid defensive player in the role that he's meant to be in, and a pretty good special teams player. He's also been practicing the last couple of weeks, so maybe you'll get him back. Kind of the same thing on a pitch count. What the Dolphins cannot do here is, even though they know these games are desperate to make the playoffs, they cannot push the envelope with either player. I don't think they will. You can't expect more out of them than they're really able to give right now, because in the way of Bradley Chubb, they absolutely need to think of him in the longer term, for next year, and not just for, this stretch of games. The rest of the game last week, offensively, Tua, he's playing on another level. He's only thrown 1 interception since he's been back. He's completing 75% of his passes. He's on his way to an NFL record for completion percentage, and he's really playing the best football he's ever played. The challenge here and the problem is the run game. And I can't even at this point of the season fault Mike McDaniel, because I think Mike McDaniel, he wants to run. I don't think he wants to run as much as I'd like him to run. I think he wants to, but I also think that he understands his O-line right now. It's got issues and it's banged up, and they're not able to create the run game that they need. What's crazy about that is when you had no Tua, albeit you had Austin Jackson at right tackle and you had a healthier line, they were running for 150, 190, 170 in those 4 games that Tua was out. And now they're struggling to get 40 to 60 yards. That's a problem, particularly for this game and particularly down this stretch, because as good as Tua is playing and as good as he can be from an efficiency perspective and from a completion percentage perspective, the big play has obviously been taken away, and it hasn't been a big part of the offense all year. You saw a little bit more of it last week, but if you're going to go into these games and you're not going to be able to run the ball and you're not going to be able to be physical up front and you're going to count on this pass game, you're not going to probably get these crazy completion percentage performances from Tua on a consistent basis, because it's making your offense a little bit too one-dimensional. Now, they did a tremendous job last week. They scored 32 points, but as we get down this stretch, particularly in a game like this next week, with 49ers, the Browns, the Jets, cold weather, the run game, it's got to be there. The running football is December football, is playoff football, is winning football. Now, the challenge of this from an offensive line perspective, without Jackson, you're probably not going to have Teron Armstead. you're going to be out both of your tackles for this game, most likely. That's going to hurt big time because the Texans, albeit they're not a great team, they're a pretty good team. They have some bookends that can get after the quarterback and that can make Tua uncomfortable, even with his quick release. If you don't have a run game to offset it, that's going to hurt, and that's going to put a lot of pressure on Tua to come through. And in this game, with the way the defense is playing, you're really going to have to score 30 if you think you're going to have any shot. So, some news just broke today. Odell Beckham Jr., 9 catches, 55 yards in his Dolphin career. They parted ways. I mean, you want to talk about another indictment of Chris Grier? Chris Grier, can you stop signing guys in their 30s who are over the hill, who are just here for a money grab to play in Miami, and who actually don't want to be a part of the team? Odell Beckham Jr., you signed him hurt, and he missed 4 games. He then finally gets in the mix. He does nothing. He's moping around the field. Every report about him is that he just didn't want to be here and didn't want to play. And now, boom, you cut him in your biggest stretch of the year. It's just, and you paid him $2 million. You could have used that $2 million for a pass rusher that we needed, for a guard that we needed, but instead you paid an over-the-hill wide receiver who doesn't want to play for your team. So another beautiful indictment of Chris Grier and why, in my opinion, his time has passed him and he shouldn't be here. He's going to be here, unfortunately. But in my opinion, this is just another indictment on a poor move by him. And my problem with Chris Grier and a lot of the moves that he makes is this. He works with an owner that will spend more money than anybody. If you didn't have a salary cap, Stephen Ross would be in the top 5 of guys who would spend the most money in the league. And he still does, and he signs checks. So you as a GM, it's not impressive if you can go out and sign a name in their 30s. I could do that. What's impressive to me is, can you get bargain players that are going to contribute? You can draft them well, you can develop them well, and you don't have to pay them an arm and a leg. And those are the guys that this team is missing. The Andrew Van Ginkels who you let go, a lot of these guys in the trenches, guys like Christian Wilkins that you could have signed ahead of time. And that is the fundamental flaw of the Dolphins organization right now. And something has to give. Now, where we're at right now, where you have these 4 games to go, and essentially it's pretty simple. You win 4, you go 10-7, Broncos would have to lose 2. I don't see it happening. I think it's a pipe dream and a half. 1, you winning 4, it would be 5 in a row. The Broncos, yes, they have a decent shot of losing a couple games, fine. But I find it hard to believe that they're going to win 4 in a row here. And where does that leave them? Somebody's talked about this week about them having a successful season or not. If they do not win a playoff game, this is not a successful season. Even if they go and win 10 and they win the 5 in a row and they made the playoffs, that's still not a successful season to me, because the bar was raised last year when you paid guys, you brought guys back, you paid everybody and their mother. We went into the year saying you need to win a playoff game. We really said you need to win your division, which is already long gone, and you need to then win a playoff game. Unless they win a playoff game, this is not a successful season. Now, I've said it before, and there'll be other time to talk about this. The offseason for this team is going to be very, very important. Nobody's getting fired. I would be floored and shocked, McDaniel, Grier, if anybody got fired. Barring they lose 4 in a row here, even at that, I don't think anybody's getting fired, because it's just not what the way is right now. With the way the money is, the way the guys are locked up, all these contracts, you'd have to get a new GM in here who's going to want to accept McDaniel on a 3-year deal. It's just not what's probably going to happen. And there's been a lot of reports and a lot of false reporting. Hey, he's on the hot seat. Hey, this, hey, that. If you ask me, none of them are going anywhere, irregardless of what happens at the end of this year. They're going to reevaluate it. They're going to make some moves. And then next year, everybody comes back on a very, very hot seat to see what the next move is for this organization. Now, when you look at the game last week and you look at the totality of this season and where this team is at this point in week 15 or whatever week we're in at this point, you are what you are. This team is not going to change. The physicality that's not there is not all of a sudden going to show up. So when it comes to this particular game against Houston, there's a couple of factors you have to think about. Number one, the Dolphins do not win the big game that they need to win in the spot that they need to win it. They beat up on bad teams. They've done it for 3 years. And they very, very rarely win that big game against a playoff opponent, particularly on the road, outside of the Rams game Monday night about a month ago. So this, again, they get this spotlight thrust upon them where everybody doubts them that they're going to win this game. Can they actually change a narrative? You won't get me to believe they're going to change a narrative until they actually change it. It was the same thing in Green Bay. They didn't suck me in against the Packers to think they were going to win that game. They didn't suck me in against Buffalo this year. You're not going to get me to believe it's happening until it happens. Now, when you analyze this entire game, is this winnable for the Dolphins? Absolutely. If they could come out, play their game, establish a semblance of a run game, get me 90 to 100 to 110 on the ground, control the game. The Texans have their issues. The Texans' O-line is decimated. It's not that great. C.J. Stroud has had a bit of a sophomore slump because of it. They do have a pretty decent run game with Mixon. And it's funny, if you think back to the early years of the Texans in the early 2000s, they owned the Dolphins. And they were 5-0 against the Dolphins to start as a franchise, and there were some gut-wrenching losses. The Dolphins have made up for it in recent vintage. But where we're at now, the Texans are a better team than you. And we can also think about, and it's been much talked about this week, the Laramie Tunsil trade from 2019, right before the beginning of the year. It gave the Dolphins all the draft picks and the ability to get Tyreek Hill, to get Waddle, to get Tua, but who really won the deal? I think ultimately both teams won in some regard, but the Texans have won in the playoffs. The Texans have a franchise QB. They have the franchise tackle that you traded to them, and you now have a lot of speed and a lot of talent, but not a lot of wins, and particularly a lot of playoff wins. So it's a very interesting dynamic between both franchises, and it makes it a very, very intriguing game. And I want to believe they can come out and they can do some different things and win this game and not beat themselves. But like I said before, I truly believe at this point you are what you are. And the ceiling for this team is probably not going to be 9 wins. They're probably going to go, through whatever would be 3-1, but they're just not going to do what they need to do. It's going to be 9-8 or 8-9, and it'll frustrate you because what'll probably happen is they lose to the Texans, and then they'll come out and beat the 49ers, and then beat the Browns and beat the Jets. And you're going to sit there and you're going to be pissed because you would have made the playoffs if you just would have knocked off the Texans. So, that being said, hoping that I'm dead wrong, because it would really be amazing for them to actually change the narrative. Let's call this game the change the narrative game, because the narrative is you cannot beat a good team in a big spot on the road with your playoff lives on the line. You can't do it. So, can we change the narrative this week? I'm going to tell you right now, in Steve Gio's Week 15 Miami Dolphin pick in the league where they play for pay. Dolphins, Texans, Houston, 1 o'clock Sunday. Texans are favored by 3. Over-under is 47. Very, very intriguing matchup. Texans also off of a bye, which is important to think about. They were able to rest up and heal up. Dolphins with their defensive issues last week, but the Texans have some issues of their own. I do think the Dolphins are going to come out. I think they're going to play a spirited game. I think Tua is going to play to the level that he's been playing. But ultimately, this will be a game, much like the Buffalo game in Buffalo earlier in the year, where offensively you did a lot of really good things and you put up a lot of points. But 1, you didn't score in the big spot at the end of the game. And 2, your defense let you down. This defense has been a disappointment, in my opinion, for the most of the year. I like Anthony Weaver as a defensive coordinator, but your problem here is this. They don't get enough turnovers and takeaways. They have 7 interceptions all year long, and they don't get any sacks. I think the Dolphins lose this game 30-20, bringing them to 6-8, and then we have 3 games down the stretch, and you would really, really need a miracle to make the playoffs. So let's pray I'm wrong. Dolphins, can you come out and win a big game, please? Ever? That'd be like mind-blowing if you could actually do that. We'll see you next week. Let's go Dolphins.